Omar Ahmad loved languages. Most people love their pets unconditionally, but for Omar, it was languages. He poured himself into them with the same passion. The excitement of learning a new dialect or discovering a forgotten script was a thrill that no one else seemed to understand. But like anyone who dedicates themselves to something with fervor, there were moments of frustration too. Today, that frustration had reached a boiling point. Why is it so hard to understand this? Omar muttered under his breath. His students stared blankly at the blackboard as he tried to explain the intricacies of fatal formal grammar. No, he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The auxiliary verb goes before the temporal marker, not the other way around. A hand shot up in the back of the room. It was Emily, one of the more curious students, though she often had trouble keeping up. But Professor Ahmad, she asked, why would aliens care about Renaissance fairs? Omar pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to suppress the urge to sigh. That's not the point, Emily. I'm trying to explain how complex languages can hold deeper meanings than just simple words. His words barely made a dent in the collective confusion of his students, their eyes glazed over with boredom. Just as he was about to give up and explain analogies in simpler terms, a knock at the door interrupted him. The class fell silent as the door swung open. A man stepped in, tall and confident, wearing a suit that looked far more expensive than anything Omar could afford. His shoes gleamed like polished obsidian, and his smile, although practiced, radiated authority. Professor Ahmad. The man's voice was smooth, oozing confidence, as though he was accustomed to commanding rooms. Matthew Dowse, CEO of Dowse Technologies. Mind if I borrow a moment of your time? Omar blinked in surprise, his mind racing. This was no ordinary visitor. His students immediately perked up at the mention of Dowse Technologies. Phones were being pulled out, some to snap pictures, others to check who this CEO actually was. They had heard of Dowse before, of course. His company was a tech giant, a leader in interstellar communication systems. But what was someone like him doing in Omar's little lecture hall? Class dismissed, Omar said quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. His students filed out of the room, most of them trying to sneak a photo of the famous businessman. Their attention, once on ancient languages, was now entirely on the high-powered CEO. The classroom was eerily quiet once everyone had left. Omar turned to face Dowse, who had casually made himself comfortable in one of the student chairs, as if he had all the time in the galaxy. He looked completely at ease, a stark contrast to Omar's growing anxiety. Mr. Dowse, what can I help you with? Omar asked, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. He had worked as a freelance translator for several companies in the past, but nothing remotely close to the magnitude of Dowse Technologies. Dowse chuckled softly, his gaze piercing. I need you to help me with something. Something only you can do. Omar raised an eyebrow, unsure whether he was being complimented or set up for something far more complex. He had worked with various companies, but Dowse was in another league altogether. I don't usually take on big corporate projects, but I'm listening, Omar said, his mind racing. Dowse leaned forward, his hands resting on the table as he spoke. You see, there's a language, an ancient language, and I need you to help decode it. Omar's eyes widened. Ancient language. He echoed, not sure if he had heard him correctly. What do you mean by that? Dowse didn't immediately answer. Instead, he took a deep breath, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then he spoke again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's a language from Earth's forgotten past, a language that may hold the key to humanity's survival. Omar was stunned. The idea of a forgotten Earth language seemed absurd. There had been no known languages that could be traced back to a time before recorded history. What was Dowse implying? How could this mysterious, ancient language be so important? And why, of all people, was Dowse asking Omar for help? Just as the room grew heavy with uncertainty, Dowse gave him a meaningful look. I'm not just talking about any language, Dowse continued. I'm talking about the language of the hive. The mention of the hive sent a chill down Omar's spine. He had heard the rumors, the legends. Some said the hive was an ancient race of beings, long gone from the universe. Others believed the hive was a myth, a story told by the very first colonists who encountered it. But to hear Dawes speak of it in such a serious tone was something Omar couldn't ignore. This was no idle fantasy. "Are you sure?" Omar asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "The hive? That can't be real." Dawes simply nodded, his face grim. "It's real. And it's coming back." Omar could barely process the words. The hive, if it was indeed real, was something far beyond anything he had ever studied. The implications were enormous. This could mean the return of an ancient race, one that could change everything humanity knew about the universe. And somehow it was all tied to the language of the hive, the very language that had been lost to time. Dawes stood up slowly, fixing his sharp gaze on Omar. "I need you to help me translate it. We have a chance to decode their secrets before they do. It's our only chance to survive." Omar felt the weight of the request settle over him, the language of the hive, and the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. This was no ordinary translation project. This was something that could change everything. And Omar had just become a key player in the survival of humanity itself. Omar couldn't shake the words from his mind. The hive is coming back. He had barely slept the entire night, the weight of Dawes's cryptic message haunting him. Who were the hive? And why would anyone, especially Dawes, ask for his help with something so otherworldly? The next morning, Omar tried to focus on his usual routine. The coffee was bitter, the students in his next class distracted, and the lessons, as always, felt like they weren't reaching anyone. But in the back of his mind, one question burned relentlessly. What did Dawes know? After his last class, Omar found himself standing outside the lecture hall, still lost in thought. He wasn't sure if he should call Dawes or just pretend the entire conversation had been a bizarre dream. But something about Dawes's calm demeanor, the gravity in his voice, told Omar this was no dream. The hive was real. He needed to know more. Taking a deep breath, Omar pulled out his phone and dialed the number Dawes had given him. The phone rang once, twice, then a click. "Ahmad," Dawes's voice came through the line, sharp as ever, but this time with a hint of urgency. "Mr. Dawes," Omar said, his voice uncertain but determined. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the hive. I need to know more." There was a pause on the other end. Omar could hear Dawes's deep breath, as though he were considering how much to reveal. Then, with a low sigh, Dawes spoke. "Meet me at the Dawes Technologies headquarters in 2 hours," Dawes said, his tone final, "and bring your best understanding of ancient languages." Omar's heart skipped a beat. Dawes was offering him access to something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. But was he ready? Could he truly understand what he was about to learn? 2 hours later, Omar stood in front of the sleek, glass building that housed Dawes Technologies. The towering structure seemed to pierce the sky itself, a symbol of Dawes's vast empire. As Omar stepped through the glass doors, the cool air inside brushed against his skin, and he was immediately led by a security guard to the elevator. The ride up was silent, and Omar's nerves grew with every passing floor. What could Dawes possibly want from him? And why now? Omar wasn't a cryptographer or an archaeologist. He was just a linguistics professor. Yet, somehow, he had become entangled in something far bigger than a simple language puzzle. When the elevator doors finally opened, Omar found himself in a high-tech office that seemed to hum with energy. Monitors flashed with data, and assistants hurried across the polished floors. Dawes stood by a massive glass desk, staring out at the city below. "Ah, Professor Ahmad. I was wondering when you'd get here," Dawes said without turning. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he were used to making people feel uneasy. Omar stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. You said you needed my help. What's going on here? Daos turned to face him, a slight smile on his lips. Let's just say that the hive has a history with humanity, and this language you'll help me translate. It holds the key to unlocking everything. Omar frowned. What do you mean by history? The hive was just a myth, right? A story told by ancient civilizations. Daos's smile faded, and for the first time, Omar saw a flicker of something darker in his eyes. The hive is no myth. They'd been watching us for centuries, waiting. And now, they're coming. Omar felt a chill run through him. But why now? Why is it important for me to help with this language? What do you need to decode? Daos stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The language of the hive isn't just any ancient dialect. It's a weapon, a way to control entire species, the key to understanding how the hive operates, how they manipulate not just language, but reality itself. It's all in their words. Omar's mind raced as the implications sank in. A language that could control entire species, that could alter reality itself. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. Why me? Omar asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why do you need me to do this? Daos looked at him with cold, calculating eyes. Because you're one of the few people in the world who can understand the depth of this language. You have a mind for complexity, for the nuances of ancient dialects. Without you, we don't stand a chance. Omar took a step back, his mind spinning. If Daos was right, this wasn't just a translation job. It was a race against time, and the fate of humanity could very well depend on Omar's ability to unlock the secrets of the hive. We need to begin immediately, Daos said, his voice firm. Time is running out. Omar had no choice but to agree. This wasn't just an academic challenge. This was a fight for survival. And whether he was ready or not, he had been pulled into something that would change the course of human history forever. As Daos led him to a secure room at the back of the building, Omar couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. A beginning that would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about the world and the universe. Omar felt the weight of the moment as Daos led him through the high-security hallway into a small, hidden room at the back of the building. The walls were lined with monitors displaying complex symbols, and a sleek metallic table sat in the center, covered with strange artifacts. The air in the room was thick with tension, and Omar couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to unfold. "Sit down, Professor," Daos said, gesturing to a chair opposite the table. "We don't have much time." Omar sat, still reeling from the revelations of the past few hours. The hive, a language that could control entire species. His mind buzzed with questions. Was this truly happening? Was the hive real? And why was Daos so confident that Omar could unlock its secrets? "You're not just here to translate words," Daos continued, sitting across from him. "You're here because the hive's language is a key to understanding their power. The power to manipulate minds, control reality itself. If we don't stop them, they'll take control of humanity, and everything we've built will be lost." Omar's head was spinning. But how does this work? How can a language do all that? Daos stood and walked over to a large screen on the wall. He tapped a few buttons, and the screen flickered to life, revealing a complex pattern of symbols. Symbols Omar had never seen before, yet something about them seemed strangely familiar. As he stared at the screen, his heart raced. "These are the ancient symbols of the hive," Daos said, his voice low. "They're not just characters. They're codes. Codes that unlock power, the ability to rewrite the very fabric of reality." Omar felt his stomach twist. He had spent years studying ancient languages, but nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't just a puzzle. It was a weapon. He looked back at Daos. "But why me? Why did you choose me to do this?" Daos met his gaze. "Because you have a unique ability. Your understanding of language is unlike anyone else's. You see the connections between words and meaning. You can decipher things others can't. And the hive's language is all about those connections, hidden meanings, subtle shifts in tone. If anyone can unlock its secrets, it's you. Omar swallowed hard. He had always been proud of his linguistic skills, but this was different. The weight of what Dawes was asking him to do felt almost unbearable. Could he really be the key to stopping something so vast and powerful? "Let's begin," Dawes said, his voice steady. "I'll show you the first fragment." He placed a small device on the table, and a holographic projection of the symbols flickered above it. Omar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, as he studied the ancient characters. "These are the first words of the hive's language," Dawes explained. "We've managed to decode part of it, but the real challenge is unlocking the rest. The more you understand, the clearer the picture becomes, and the closer we get to understanding how the hive works." Omar's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the symbols. They were unlike anything he had ever encountered. The structure was alien, but the patterns were strangely familiar. It was as if the language was both foreign and yet deeply ingrained in him, calling to something primal within his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting his instincts take over. Slowly, the symbols began to shift in his mind, rearranging themselves, and a deep understanding started to form. He couldn't explain how it was happening, but it was as if the language was speaking to him, whispering its meaning directly into his thoughts. "The first part," Omar muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a command, a call to action." Dawes's eyes widened. "What kind of command?" Omar furrowed his brow as the symbols continued to shift in his mind. "It's not just a command. It's a compulsion, a way to make someone act, to force them to do something against their will." Dawes nodded, his expression serious. "Exactly. The hive's language doesn't just convey meaning, it controls the mind. It bypasses logic, bypasses reason, and taps into something far more primal. It can make a person obey without question. It can even alter their perception of reality." Omar's breath caught in his throat. This was far worse than he had imagined. The hive didn't just want to communicate, they'd wanted to dominate, to control entire civilizations. "I have to know more," Omar said, his voice shaking. "What happens if we can't stop them? What are they planning?" Dawes's gaze darkened. "The hive has been watching humanity for millennia. They've studied us, learned from us. They know our weaknesses, our fears, and they know how to exploit them. If they succeed in using their language to control humanity, we will become nothing more than puppets. We'll lose everything, our freedom, our identity, our future." Omar's mind was racing. He had always loved languages for their beauty, for the way they connected people across cultures. But this was something else entirely. A language that could reshape reality, that could enslave entire worlds. The implications were terrifying. "We have to stop them," Omar said, his voice firm. "We can't let this happen." Dawes looked at him, his face grim. "We're not just stopping them. We're fighting for our survival. And we're running out of time." As Omar began to study the symbols more intensely, his understanding deepened. But with each revelation, the danger became more apparent. The hive wasn't just a threat from another world. They were a force that had already infiltrated humanity's very language. And if they could control language, they could control everything. Omar sat in stunned silence, his mind whirling with the new understanding of what he was dealing with. The implications of what he had uncovered about the hive's language were horrifying. It was more than just a set of symbols. It was a weapon, a power capable of bending minds and reshaping reality itself. The weight of the task Dawes had set before him felt unbearable, and yet there was no turning back now. "This is much bigger than anything I've ever encountered," Omar said, his voice filled with disbelief. He couldn't seem to grasp the full scope of what he had just learned. The symbols on the holographic screen continued to shift, swirling in his mind, but no matter how hard he tried to focus, he couldn't stop thinking about the power these ancient words held. Dawes remained silent for a long moment, watching Omar with a piercing gaze. "You're just beginning to understand, Professor," he said quietly. "But there's still so much more to learn. What you saw today is only the tip of the iceberg. The hive doesn't just control individuals, it can control entire societies, entire worlds, and they've been planning their return for centuries." The room felt suddenly colder, the weight of Dawes's words pressing down on Omar's chest. He couldn't breathe properly. His mind raced with 100 questions. Why hadn't humanity noticed any signs of this threat before? How had the hive managed to stay hidden for so long? He looked at Dawes, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If they can control us, how do we fight back?" Dawes leaned forward, his expression grave. "That's the hardest part. The language is so deeply ingrained in the hive's culture that it's become part of their very DNA. It's not just words, it's a tool, a way to shape the thoughts and desires of anyone who hears it. And the longer they go without being stopped, the stronger their influence grows." Omar felt a shiver run down his spine. He had always been a student of languages, but this was nothing like anything he had ever studied. It was as if the language itself was alive, evolving, and adapting. And now it was ready to turn humanity into puppets. "But how did you find out about it?" Omar asked, trying to make sense of everything. "How did you know about the hive's language and what it could do?" Dawes's eyes darkened. "I didn't. Not at first. Like you, I thought it was just a myth, a legend from the ancient texts. But over the years, I started noticing strange things, patterns in the data, anomalies in the way certain languages worked, things that didn't make sense until one day I discovered something in the archives, something that pointed to the hive." He paused, his voice growing more serious. "I've spent years studying their influence on humanity. The hive didn't just make contact with us. They planted seeds, quietly infiltrating our minds, our cultures, without us even realizing it." Omar sat back in his chair, trying to absorb this new information. The hive's influence wasn't just limited to a few isolated incidents or unknown languages. It had been part of humanity's history from the very beginning. "Why didn't you tell anyone about this sooner?" Omar asked. "Why keep it a secret?" Dawes's expression hardened. "Because no one would have believed me. The hive is too powerful to be understood by the average person. I've seen it happen before. Anyone who tries to expose the truth becomes a target. There's no room for doubt when it comes to something this dangerous." Omar's mind raced as the gravity of the situation sank in. He wasn't just facing a linguistic challenge anymore. He was caught in a battle for humanity's very survival. "But what do we do now?" Omar asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "How do we stop them?" Dawes stared at him, his eyes cold. "We find the source of their power. We stop the hive from reawakening. And we must do it before they can unleash the full extent of their control. We can't afford to wait any longer." The urgency in Dawes's voice made Omar's pulse quicken. He knew time was running out, but how could they possibly stop a force as powerful as the hive? They were fighting an enemy that could control minds, reshape reality, and remain hidden in the shadows. Omar glanced at the holographic screen, which now displayed even more complex patterns. The symbols seemed to be calling to him, urging him to understand, to unlock their secrets. As terrifying as it was, he knew he couldn't turn back. He had to keep going. "I need to understand more," Omar said, his voice resolute. "If I'm going to help, I need to know everything. All of it." Dawes nodded slowly. "I expected nothing less from you, Professor. But be warned. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. The hive doesn't like people who interfere with their plans. And if they discover that you're getting closer to the truth, they will stop at nothing to silence you." Omar took a deep breath. He had always loved a challenge, but this was different. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. If the hive succeeded in their plan, it wouldn't just mean the end of his career. It could mean the end of everything humanity had ever built. "I'm ready," Omar said, his voice steady. Whatever it takes. Dallas smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. I hope you are, Professor, because we're about to enter a world where nothing is what it seems, and if we fail, the hive will reign. As the room filled with an eerie silence, Omar's mind began to process the enormity of the task ahead. But there was no turning back now. He had been chosen to unlock the hive's language, and with it, the key to humanity's survival. The race to stop the hive had begun, and the future of the world hung in the balance. Omar couldn't shake the chilling feeling that had settled deep within him after Daz's revelations. The weight of the hive's influence on humanity was too vast, too terrifying to fully comprehend. How had they managed to stay hidden for so long? How had they manipulated entire civilizations without anyone noticing? As the hours passed in the dimly lit lab, Omar's mind raced through the implications of what he had just learned. The hive wasn't just a threat to a few isolated worlds. It was a threat to everything. It had already laid the groundwork, subtly shaping the course of human history. But now that Omar had discovered their language, could he find a way to stop them before they reawakened? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft peep of his communicator. It was a message from Daos. Omar, you need to come to the Central Archive. We've uncovered something that might be crucial. You're going to need to see this for yourself. Omar quickly gathered his things and made his way to the Central Archive, his heart pounding in his chest. The journey felt longer than it actually was, each step adding to the growing sense of dread that weighed on him. The deeper he delved into this mystery, the more he realized that nothing was as it seemed. When Omar arrived, Daos was already there, his face tense and focused. The archive was filled with holographic displays of ancient texts and symbols, all linked to the hive's language. We found something, Daos said without looking up from the screen. A hidden archive. It wasn't in any of the public databases. Someone, perhaps a member of the hive's old sympathizers, left us a clue. Omar stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. What is it? Daos gestured to the hologram. It's a message, a warning. And I think it's telling us that the hive is closer to waking up than we realized. Someone tried to seal the language away, but it seems to be leaking out into the world. Omar's stomach turned. Are you saying that the hive has already started to take control? Daos nodded grimly. Yes, but not just any part of humanity. This is much worse. The symbols, the words, they've begun to influence our most powerful leaders, the ones who make decisions that can change the fate of entire nations. If they gain control over them, it's over. They'll have the power to shape the world however they want. Omar felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The idea that people in positions of power could be unknowingly manipulated was terrifying. The hive was not just a force to be reckoned with. It was a force that could bring entire governments to their knees. We can't let that happen, Omar said, his voice shaky but determined. I know, Daos replied, his gaze intense, but we need to act fast. The hive is using a network of influence that goes far beyond anything we've ever seen. We're talking about a mind-bending level of control. People will think they're making their own choices, but in reality, they'll be puppets. Omar couldn't stop the shiver that ran down his spine. He had always known that language was powerful. Words had the ability to shape perceptions, to influence decisions. But this was something else entirely. The hive's language was not just about communication. It was a tool, a weapon capable of bending reality itself. What can we do? Omar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daos looked at him, his expression hardening. We need to find the source, the key to the hive's power. If we can destroy it, we can stop them before they're fully awakened. Omar nodded, but he knew that finding the source would not be easy. The hive had been operating in the shadows for centuries. They had planned for this moment, prepared for every possible obstacle. But Omar wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when humanity's future was at stake. We'll have to work fast, Omar said, determination in his eyes. We can't afford to waste any more time. Dallas smiled faintly. I knew I could count on you. But remember, the deeper we go, the more dangerous it will get. The hive won't just sit back and let us take away their power. They'll fight back. And if we're not careful, they'll use their language against us. Omar's mind raced as the implications of Dawes's words sank in. They were heading into uncharted territory, a world where nothing was as it seemed. The hive would use every tool at its disposal to protect itself. But Omar had no choice. He had to keep going. The survival of humanity depended on it. He turned to Dawes, his resolve firm. Let's do it. We'll find the source, and we'll stop the hive. Together. Dawes nodded, his face serious. I hope we're ready for what's coming, because once we begin, there's no turning back. As the two men set off to uncover the hive's secrets, Omar felt a growing sense of urgency. The race was on. If they didn't act quickly, the hive would be unstoppable, and humanity would fall, helpless against the invisible force that had been manipulating them all along. In this part, the tension escalates as Dawes and Omar uncover a crucial piece of the hive's plan, its attempt to control powerful leaders, and by extension, the entire world. The stakes are higher than ever, and Omar realizes just how deep the hive's influence runs. The suspense builds as they prepare to confront this unimaginable threat head-on, knowing that failure is not an option. Omar couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation. Every piece of information they uncovered led them deeper into a tangled web of conspiracy and hidden power. The hive was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and they were now fully aware of his existence. He and Dawes had to be cautious, every step a calculated risk. The central archive was abuzz with activity as the two men worked tirelessly. Dawes had managed to locate the transmission that had been sent out centuries ago. It was a message, encrypted so deeply that only a select few could understand it. And now, thanks to their breakthroughs, it was slowly becoming clear. Omar felt a flicker of doubt. Could they really stop something as powerful as the hive? They were just two people, after all, against an enemy that had been planning its rise for millennia. Their chances seemed slim. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered the faces of the people they were fighting for, the billions of humans who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He couldn't afford to let them down. "We're getting closer," Dawes said, his voice tense as he scanned a series of newly uncovered symbols. This could be it, the key to stopping them. Omar leaned over, squinting at the hologram. "What's this?" Dawes's finger hovered above the symbols, tracing the intricate patterns. "This is a sequence that has been appearing on Earth's communications network for years now. It's almost like a virus, spread through seemingly innocent messages. But when pieced together, it reveals something terrifying." Omar felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" "The hive has been sending out encrypted messages," Dawes explained. "Not just on Earth, but on every human-occupied world. It's their way of planting seeds, infiltrating human minds. They're preparing for something. And it's not just about taking over powerful leaders. It's much bigger." Omar absorbed the information, his thoughts racing. If the hive was infiltrating communications networks, it meant that their influence was already far-reaching. It wasn't just about controlling the government anymore. It was about controlling the entire population. And that would be disastrous. "They're manipulating us," Omar said, the realization sinking in. "They're conditioning us to accept them, to be complacent when they finally reveal themselves. By the time we figure out what's happening, it'll be too late." Dawes didn't respond immediately. His face was tight with concern. "That's what I'm afraid of. But this sequence might be the key to unraveling it all. If we can trace the origin, we might be able to find their central command." Omar nodded, determination lighting a fire within him. "Then let's find it. Let's stop them before they have a chance to complete their plans." Dawes gestured to a nearby console, his hands flying over the controls. "It won't be easy. We'll need to break into the main hive network. That's where they're hiding their most crucial information. But if we can crack it, we'll have everything we need. As Dow's continued to work, Omar's mind raced. The situation was growing more dire with every passing second. He had never felt the weight of responsibility more than he did now. The fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. If they failed, if they didn't act quickly enough, the hive would rise, and the world would fall. Omar glanced at Dawes. What happens if they know we're coming? Dawes' face was unreadable. If they know, we'll be in danger. They have resources we can't even imagine. But we have to take that risk. If we don't, they win. Suddenly, a sharp ping rang out, and the system flickered. Dawes froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Something's happening," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I think they've detected us." The lights above them flickered, and the hum of the archive seemed to grow louder. Omar's heart raced. They had crossed a line. The hive knew they were coming for them. "They're locking us out," Dawes muttered. "I can't get access to the main system anymore. We need to move fast." Without warning, the doors to the archive slammed shut. The sound was deafening, followed by the hiss of air as the room was sealed off. Omar's pulse quickened as he looked around. They were trapped. "What's going on?" Omar demanded, his voice tight with anxiety. Dawes was already tapping frantically at his console. "They've initiated a lockdown. They know we found something important. We need to get out of here." But as Dawes tried to override the system, the walls began to shake, and the floor beneath them rumbled with the vibrations of something massive moving just beyond their reach. The hive was coming. "We need to go, now," Dawes shouted. Omar barely had time to process the words before the entire building seemed to shift. The ground trembled as massive steel doors closed off all exits, and the lights dimmed to a haunting red. The hive was preparing for something, and they were right in its path. Omar grabbed Dawes' arm and pulled him toward the nearest exit, but it was too late. The room was already filling with smoke, and the air seemed to grow thick with tension. A low hum reverberated through the walls. Something alive, something that knew they were there. As they made their way toward the only remaining door, the lights flickered out entirely. They were plunged into darkness. "Get ready," Dawes said quietly, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. "This is it." The door to the outside world seemed so far away, but they had no choice. They had to escape the hive's clutches. It was the only way they could survive, and if they survived, they might still have a chance to stop the hive from awakening. But as they pushed through the smoke-filled hallways, Omar couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control. The hive had already begun to fight back, and now it was a race against time. Would they make it out alive, or would the hive take them down before they could stop its deadly influence? As they reached the final door, the answer seemed clear. The hive had awakened, and it wasn't going to let them escape. The last door loomed before them, but it didn't open. The escape seemed impossible. Omar and Dawes slammed their palms against the cold metal, trying desperately to break through. The hum of the hive grew louder, like a pulse vibrating through the walls, shaking the very foundation beneath their feet. Time was running out. "We need to move, now," Dawes yelled, his voice frantic. He pushed at the door with all his strength, but it refused to budge. Omar's heart raced as the walls closed in around them. The hive was onto them. They had triggered a countdown, and every second they wasted brought them closer to their doom. The building seemed to be alive with energy, its every surface vibrating as if something monstrous was ready to break free. Suddenly, the lights flickered one last time, and then everything went dark. For a brief moment, they were engulfed in complete silence. It felt as though time had stopped, the terrifying hum of the hive gone for just a heartbeat. But the silence didn't last. The ground beneath them shook violently, and a sharp screech filled the air. Omar stumbled, his heart pounding in his chest. The hive was moving. They were far more than just a threat. They were a force of nature. "What is happening?" Omar gasped, struggling to maintain his balance as the building quaked. Dow's, his face pale and eyes wide, looked around in confusion. I think the hive has started its final phase," Dow's said, voice shaking. "If we don't get out of here, we're done for." Omar could see the panic in Dawes' eyes. This was the moment they had been fearing. The hive wasn't just preparing to invade. It was awakening, ready to take over everything. Every attempt they had made to stop it was a step closer to failure. And now it was too late to turn back. The air around them became thick with a strange, almost electric energy. The walls pulsed with every heartbeat of the hive, and the entire structure seemed to be closing in, as though it were shrinking. "Can you override the system?" Omar asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dawes' fingers flew over the console, but the screen flickered erratically. "I can't. It's too secure. It's locking everything down." Desperation surged in Omar's chest. They were running out of time. Their only option now was to escape through the building's emergency exits, if they could find them before the hive's power reached its peak. Omar turned and sprinted toward the nearest emergency stairwell, grabbing Dawes by the arm and pulling him along. The walls seemed to be closing in around them, the corridors narrowing as the building reacted to the hive's awakening. With each step, Omar could feel the pressure building in his chest. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if they were running out of room to breathe. The sound of the hive's hum grew louder, more distorted, until it felt like it was coming from inside his skull. "This way," Dawes shouted, pulling Omar toward a narrow passage they hadn't noticed before. "We're almost there." Omar followed Dawes, his mind racing. How had things gotten so bad, so fast? One minute, they were researching a way to stop the hive, and the next, they were fighting for their lives to escape it. There was no time to think, no time for second guesses. They had to move, and they had to move quickly. As they reached the end of the passage, the final emergency door stood in front of them, just a few feet away. But before they could reach it, a booming, deep sound reverberated through the walls, and the floor shook beneath their feet. "They're here," Omar whispered, his voice trembling. The hive was no longer just a hidden enemy. It was right on top of them. The door to the emergency exit started to close, and Omar's heart skipped a beat. They had seconds, maybe less. They weren't going to make it if they didn't act fast. With a burst of adrenaline, Omar shoved Dawes aside and dove for the door, slamming his palm against the emergency override. The door's lock released with a sharp click. "We have to move. Now," Omar shouted. They burst through the door, into the darkness beyond, but the ground trembled even more violently, throwing them off balance. Omar's pulse raced as he stumbled forward, grabbing Dawes' arm to keep him upright. The hallway stretched out before them like a never-ending tunnel, but the sound of the hive's power was right behind them. Suddenly, a loud crash rang out, and the building groaned as though it were about to collapse. They were running out of time. "What happens if we make it out?" Dawes panted, his breath short. "What if we can't stop them?" Omar didn't answer. There was no time for answers, only action. "I don't know, but we can't stop fighting," Omar said, gritting his teeth. "If we don't make it, we've got to leave a message. The world has to know what's coming." The emergency exit led them to a narrow alleyway behind the building. As they stumbled out into the open air, the trembling of the ground finally stopped. But the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise itself. The hive had fully awakened, and it was watching them. Omar and Dawes exchanged a glance. They had escaped for now. But what would the world do when the hive finally made its move? They had to be ready. The final battle was coming. Would they survive? Would humanity survive? The answer hung in the air like a ticking clock. The countdown had begun. The city was eerily quiet, as though it had been holding its breath. Omar and Dawes stood at the edge of the alley, looking out at the sprawling metropolis before them. The skyscrapers towered in the distance, their glass windows reflecting the fading light of the setting sun. But the peace was deceptive. It was as though the entire world was waiting for something, a moment of reckoning. "We don't have much time," Dao said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "The hive is still out there, growing stronger. We need to warn everyone." Omar nodded, his mind racing. Their escape had been just the beginning. The hive, the mysterious force they had discovered, wasn't just an alien threat. It was something far older, something that had been waiting, watching for millennia. Now it was awake, and it wasn't going to stop until it consumed everything in its path. They had only scratched the surface of what the hive was capable of. The truth was, the hive's power had been underestimated for too long. It wasn't just about invasion, it was about domination. And the hive had the ability to manipulate minds, twist realities, and make entire civilizations fall under its control. "We have to warn the authorities," Omar said, his eyes narrowing. "If we don't act now, the hive will wipe out everything we know." Dao's nodded, his jaw clenched. "But how do we fight something like that? We barely made it out of there alive." Omar paused for a moment, looking up at the skyline. His thoughts flashed back to the mysterious moment in the hive's core, the moment when the words of the ancient language he had spoken seemed to reverberate through the very air. He realized something in that instant. The key to defeating the hive might lie in the past, in the ancient secrets that had been lost for so long. "Maybe we don't fight it directly," Omar said, an idea forming in his mind. "Maybe we can use their own weapon against them." Dao's looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Remember what we found out about the hive's power?" Omar asked. "It's based on communication, on control. The hive isn't just a force of nature. It's a collective consciousness, and if we can break their communication, we can stop them." A spark of understanding lit in Dao's eyes. "You're talking about disrupting their mind link, but how do we even begin to do that?" Omar clenched his fists, his determination growing. "We go back to where it all started. We go to the hive's heart, the place where their collective mind is strongest. We need to find a way to sever that connection, to destroy the link that holds them together." Dao's hesitated, but then nodded. "It's crazy, but it's the only chance we have. Let's do it." Without another word, the two of them made their way to the underground transit system. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to waste a single moment. As they boarded the train, the hum of the engine drowned out the sounds of the city. But in the back of his mind, Omar couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The train sped through the tunnels, the lights flickering above them. As they traveled deeper, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, the air thick with tension. The hive's influence was growing stronger, and they could feel it in the pit of their stomachs. They were getting closer, closer to the heart of the beast. When the train finally slowed to a halt, they stepped off and into a dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with strange, alien symbols, their meaning completely unknown. But one thing was clear: this was no ordinary place. It was the hive's last stand. They moved cautiously, every step echoing in the silence. They knew they were walking into danger, but there was no turning back now. The fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating in their minds. It was not a voice in the traditional sense. It was a deep, resounding thought that filled their consciousness, a voice without form, without body. "You are too late," the voice whispered. "The hive cannot be stopped. We have existed for eons, and we will continue to exist long after you are gone." Omar and Dao's froze, their hearts racing. The voice was everywhere, surrounding them, pressing in on their minds. It was as if the hive was speaking directly to them, trying to break them, to weaken their resolve. But Omar refused to back down. He had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. He took a deep breath and whispered, "We'll see about that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ancient tablet they had recovered, the one containing the lost language of the hive's ancestors. They had studied it carefully, deciphering its symbols and patterns. Now, it was time to use it. With trembling hands, Omar activated the device. The tablet hummed to life, and the symbols on its surface began to glow with a strange, pulsating energy. A deep vibration filled the room, and the walls seemed to shake in response. The hive was reacting. Omar spoke the words, the ancient language flowing from his lips, and as he did, a powerful force erupted from the device. The hive's voice faltered, its grip on their minds weakening. It was working. But they weren't out of danger yet. The hive was fighting back, and the chamber began to collapse around them. The walls cracked, the ceiling groaned under the pressure, and the air grew thick with the scent of something burning. "Come on," Das yelled, pulling Omar toward the exit. "We've got to get out of here before it all comes down." The two of them ran, the device still pulsing in Omar's hand. The sound of the hive's voice grew louder, more desperate. They could feel it, the last, dying screams of a species that had overstayed its welcome. They reached the exit just as the building began to collapse. The door slammed shut behind them, and the ground shook beneath their feet. For a moment, everything went still, and then silence. The hive was no more. But as they stood there, panting and exhausted, they knew that the world would never be the same. They had won, for now. But the secrets of the hive, the ancient language, and the power it held, were still out there, waiting for the next time humanity would need to fight. For now, though, they had saved their world, and that was enough.